It is a great pleasure to introduce our wonderful speaker today, Pablo Jarillo-Herrero. So Pablo got his PhD in Delft in 2005. Then he was for a couple of years working as a postdoc in Columbia University, and he started in 2008 as assistant professor at MIT. He was tenured at MIT in 2015, and he became full professor in 2018. And Professor Jarillo has gotten a very, very long list of awards for the wonderful research results that he got during these few years. But let me just emphasize one of them, that is one that he just got this year, that is the 2021 US National Academy of Sciences Award for Scientific Discovery, that it is awarded once every 2 years for the most important discovery in fundamental science, including physics, chemistry, material science, and so forth. And then on the research side, the interests of Professor Jarillo lie in experimental condensed matter physics and quantum materials. And in particular, he's especially interested on electronic transport and optoelectronics in two-dimensional materials and van der Waals heterostructures, and in particular on studying and discovering new superconducting magnetic and topological properties in these materials. And among the many different discoveries that he did in the last few years, perhaps the most important one is the discovery that Pablo and his team did a few years ago in twisted bilayer graphene, demonstrated the existence of unconventional superconductivity and correlated behavior. And this discovery was extremely important for condensed matter physics, since it brought together three fields that before were somehow not so much talking to each other: the field of van der Waals materials, topology, and correlated physics. And today, Pablo is going to show us about the newest van der Waals material that show this correlated behavior. And in particular, the title of his talk is Moire Magic 3.0. So Pablo, thank you so much for giving the colloquium today. We look forward to your talk, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jose, and thank you very much, everyone, for being here. It's a pleasure to give this talk online. I remember when Jose told me about this nice series. It was quite early. I don't think there were so many online series back then, and it was great that he had initiative to start this condensed matter seminar series online. I just wish I could be there, in person. I've never been to Finland, but I hope that once COVID is over, I will have the opportunity to visit in person. So as Jose mentioned, the field of, some people call it twistronics, the field of correlated Moiré heterostructures has attracted a lot of attention. And today I want to share with you some of our latest results, which is, you can see in this animation, you can right away see what this is about, includes going from bilayers to trilayers. So let me start a little bit more from the point of view of this Moiré quantum matter, and I think many of you will agree that there is a little bit of magic in it. By now we have seen a lot of very interesting condensed matter behaviors in this Moiré quantum matter. One is correlated insulator states, which have been seen in many systems. Magic angle twisted bilayer graphene, that's what MATBG stands for, but also in ABC rhombohedral graphene aligned to hexagonal boron nitride, in twisted bilayer graphene, in transition metal dichalcogenide Moiré heterostructures, etc. This is a behavior which is sort of the first thing you look for in one of these correlated Moiré quantum systems. You also have superconductivity, which has been seen in magic angle twisted bilayer graphene and some signatures possibly in other systems. Then topological phases, which have been seen also in many of these systems. Magnetism, again, seen also in many of the systems. Nematicity, which has been seen in, so far, only in magic angle twisted bilayer graphene. And as of a few months ago, also Moiré ferroelectricity, which has been seen now in twisted layers of boron nitride and also bilayer graphene on boron nitride. So slowly we're seeing almost all of condensed matter behaviors in this type of twisted van der Waals heterostructures. Now I think many of you will agree that one of the behaviors that has attracted most of attention is that of superconductivity. Okay, and Perhaps it's because it's been one of the most unique, and of course superconductivity is a little bit special in condensed matter physics. So Magic Angle Twisted Bilayer Graphene until recently was the only robust superconductor, Moiré superconductor. Okay, and what do I mean by robust superconductivity? First, the system has to exhibit zero resistance. Okay, so these are data for two devices, from recent devices where the resistance goes down to zero, and it goes to zero as well as you can measure zero. Okay, and if you measure the VI curves, you have these flat VI curves. Let me show you a different VI curve here, because this is also flat voltage current characteristics with a sharp switching is also something you want to see in a robust superconductor. Okay, so this is data for another of the devices. You have this really zero voltage drop as well as you can measure it, and it goes together with a sharp switch to the normal state. Okay. And then the last thing, which I think perhaps is one of the most important ones, is that you should look for Josephson phase coherence. Okay, if you measure the critical current as a function of perpendicular magnetic field in these devices, because there is a little bit of disorder and you can tune the system close to the insulating behavior, you have a network of Josephson junctions which leads to Fraunhofer-like patterns of various types. Basically, the system exhibits Josephson phase coherence. I think that you need to show those three characteristics in order to claim robust superconductivity. And this is something that, these data are from some of our papers, but this has been, robust superconductivity has been reproduced in Magic Angle Twisted Bilayer Graphene by many, many, many groups, okay? Probably over a dozen now. There are a few more, in the past, since I last updated this slide. Now, this is a little bit in contrast to the signature sort of more, perhaps fragile superconductivity in other Moiré systems. Okay? So, for example, you have trilayer graphene on hexagonal boron nitride, okay, where there is some sign of superconductivities. Bilayer graphene on bilayer graphene, so twisted bi-bi, twisted transition metal dichalcogenide heterostructures, monolayer graphene on bilayer graphene. That's the latest system where in all of these systems, there is typically a key signature, which is a resistance versus temperature curves, which transitions to a low, even zero resistance state. Like, this data for twisted bi-bi in some places in the phase diagram, you can see that the resistance goes down and it goes down to actually zero. However, there are some key issues. For example, the nonlinear VI curves, there are nonlinear VI curves, but they're sort of smooth without sharp switching behavior. In any of the systems, there's no sharp switching behavior. And perhaps more importantly, there's no report in any of the systems of Josephson phase coherence from Fraunhofer-like patterns. Yeah? And the reproducibility is also very limited for, for this type of data and the different structures. So superconductivity may well still be there, but if it's there, it seems that it's very fragile and not very robust. So this, led naturally to the question, okay, could it be that Magic Angle Twisted Bilayer Graphene is the only robust Moiré superconductor for some fundamental reason, okay? And the answer by now to this question is actually not, okay? Mirror-symmetric Magic Angle Twisted Trilayer Graphene, okay, is a new robust Moiré superconductor. I'm gonna show you data. These data are in press, you will find them in press at Nature today. You can also check our archive paper. The Philip Kim group, this is one of those nice occurrences where our work, as soon as we posted, was immediately reproduced, which means it was simultaneously, simultaneous work by the group of Philip Kim, okay? So equally robust results. So let me tell you about what I'm gonna tell you about today. So I'll introduce Magic Angle Twisted Bilayer Graphene and also the Trilayer case, Magic Angle Twisted Trilayer Graphene. Then I'll show you our signatures of robust, our evidence for robust superconductivity in the system, for a highly tunable phase diagram, the observation of ultra strong coupling superconductivity. Then I'll tell you, if I have time, about the deep connection between the flavor, broken symmetry phase at nu equals 2 and superconductivity, and then a little bit, I'll end with a summary and outlook. So let me tell you about twisted bilayer graphene. Okay, so this is graphene, a honeycomb of carbon atoms. Okay, the electronic structure is given here, energy versus momentum. And as you know, near the Fermi level, near charge neutrality, we have these famous Dirac cones, okay, double Dirac cones, which tell you that electrons in graphene behave as ultra-relativistic massless Dirac particles. Now, this is the reciprocal space, so this is the first Brillouin zone. And if you have a finite Fermi energy, okay, your Fermi surface is a disk, you can see them here. We have two inequivalent valleys or Dirac cones, the one at K and at K prime, okay? The others are copies by reciprocal space lattice vectors. Yeah? Now, what happens if you put graphene on top of graphene? Okay, in real space, the real space lattices would be a line, okay, if you just put it exactly on top. And in momentum space, the reciprocal spaces are also a line. Yeah? Now, if you rotate these two lattices in real space, the momentum spaces, also the reciprocal spaces, also rotate. And in particular, that leads to a separation of the Dirac cones in momentum space. Yeah? Now, this separation in momentum space between the charge neutrality points of the Dirac cone of layer 1 and Dirac cone of layer 2 is proportional to the sine of half the rotation angle. Yeah? Now, let's take a small rotation angle such that the separation in momentum is proportional to the angle. Okay, and let's see what happens there. So this is the situation that would occur if the electrons in the two graphene sheets, they did not, in each graphene sheet did not know about the other graphene sheet, okay? This Dirac cones, they would just interpenetrate each other, their separation proportional to the angle. However, when we put two graphene sheets on top of each other, the electrons are just 3 angstroms, the two graphene sheets are just 3 angstroms apart. So the electrons are very much aware that they can go from one sheet to the other, okay? They can tunnel. All right, so this interlayer hybridization, okay, leads to a gap opening here. Bonding antibonding, this is similar to bonding antibonding states in the hydrogen molecule, but in this case, it's in if you want, a graphene molecule. Yeah. So one of these bands gets pushed down to very low energies. Okay, and now this is the situation where this interlayer hybridization is small compared to the absolute value of this crossing point. As you now decrease the twist angle, this band gets pushed down to lower and lower energies until it reaches 0. Okay, so that is a situation that then we say that the flat band condition has been reached, and in graphene it says that it has been reached at the magic angle. Yeah, this magic angle for graphene on top of graphene, it's 1.1 degrees. Okay, and this term magic angle was coined by Bistritzer and McDonald. There was at about the same time, a little bit earlier, there was also very interesting work by the group of Suarez-Moiré, calculating also these flat bands, and very interesting work by the group of Eva and Ray on STM, looking at von Hoff singularities that occur at these energies, and they saw that those von Hoff singularities, went to 0, okay, at about this angle. So there was a lot of interesting work on the single particle physics of this system already, about a decade ago. Now, this thing that I showed you before was a schematic, okay, sort of a cartoon schematic. Let me show you an actual calculation of how this happens, okay? So you can see here the two reciprocal spaces of the two graphene sheets. This is the superlattice Brillouin zone, and this is a video of the electronic structure. Let me see. Oh, I need to get rid of this laser pointer to be able to show you the video. Let me just run it. Okay, so you can see how as the angle decreases, this electronic structure, which before looked just like graphene, gets reconstructed, and you have this very flat there band at about 1.1 degree. Okay, so let me just show you. So include this Latin relaxation, although this angle keeps changing depending on what model, but you have this very flat electronic structure there. Okay. Now let me put back my laser pointer. Okay. So, a couple of years ago, to our, big surprise when we make devices at this angle, I mean, it wasn't complete, we observed this correlated insulator state, which occur at 2 electrons and 2 holes per Moiré unit cell. So these are, we have single particle insulator states, but then we have correlated insulator states back then we call this half filling of the conduction and the valence bands, okay? But it's, now we use different terminology. Basically this occurs for 2 electrons, 2 holes per more unit cell. And this correlated insulator behavior only occurs in a narrow angular range around 1.1 degrees, okay? Something like between 1 and 1.2 degrees, if you push me 0.95 and 1.25 degrees. Okay? Now we were looking back then for insulator states, but not of this type actually. And then the biggest surprise came when we doped around these correlated insulator states and we saw superconducting domes, okay? Here you can see resistance versus temperature went down to 0. And this is something that has been measured by many, many groups now. So this was very exciting, okay? Now, I want to show you the phase diagram of magic angle. I want to tell you a couple of things about magic angle twisted bilayer graphene before we go to trilayer. So this is the first diagram that one can obtain from global transport measurements, okay? Don't pay too much attention to the details. It's schematic, it's twist angle dependent, and it's evolving quite fast, okay? But let's say overall, okay, what you see is in a temperature versus filling factor, this is charge density normalized, okay? So this is telling you, this filling factor nu is telling you the number of electrons or holes per Moiré unit cell, okay? So we typically show this from -4 to 4. It turns out these flat bands, okay, can contain up to 8 electrons per Moiré unit cell. So you go from charge neutrality down to the bottom, you go 4 holes per Moiré unit cell. Then you hit this single particle band insulator. So this is what you get. Okay, a band insulator at 4 holes per Moiré unit cell. If from charge neutrality you fill with electrons, at 4 electrons per Moiré unit cell, you hit again a band insulator. Okay. Now in the middle, when you're working in these flat bands, what you have is at each integer, from -3 all the way to 3, okay, electron holes per Moiré unit cell, you have some feature at these integers. The most pronounced are typically the correlated insulator states at nu equals 2 and -2, often also at 3. And then at 1 and -1, typically you have a correlated semi-metal state. You have a resistance peak quite often at 1, not very present at -1 actually. Yeah? But this is typically metallic behavior, not insulating behavior. But still, there is an enhancement in resistance as a function of doping here. And then at charge neutrality, depending on a variety of parameters, you can have a Dirac semi-metal or insulator state. Okay, all of these things depend on twist angle, also on alignment to hexagonal nitride, etc. So this type of diagrams have been seen by many people, and the STM work has also essentially seen this. Now, other than the insulated states or semi-metal states, what is also interesting is that you see in certain regions superconductivity. The most pronounced and more robust superconducting dome as the one at 2 holes plus extra holes per Moiré unit cell. This is the biggest dome, typically. You also see quite frequently the one at 2 electrons plus extra more electrons. And you see sometimes these other domes, and here and there have been some reports of some other domes in some of the regions of this phase diagram, okay? But these are the most robust, especially this one and this one. Now, the other thing that I want to tell you, which is quite important for Trilayer, is that last year, in a paper in collaboration with Shah Halilani at the Weizmann Institute and similar work, similar related work by the group of Alijes and at Princeton, we realized that there is this cascade of phase transitions, we called it in Magic Angle twisted bilayer graphene, as you go through each of these integers, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. I mean, 1, 2, 3. Yeah. If you measure the compressibility, so if you measure the thermodynamic properties of the system, okay, you measure the chemical potential, you measure the compressibility, you can see in this case, this is d mu dn, okay, the variation of the chemical potential with charge density, which is the inverse compressibility, okay. You can see that there is this sawtooth behavior, okay, which occurs, around each integer, yeah. And this is by now when the stat, this is, it should be interpreted as a cascade of phase transition. So phase transition is happening at each of these integers. Yeah? And at each of these integers, what's happening is that the system is decided to flavor polarize in some direction. Okay, the symmetry is breaking some the system is breaking some symmetries and is flavor polarizing in some directions. These symmetries which the system has are a spin and valley. Okay, so you can have the electrons in graphene can have spin up and down and valley k prime. That's 4. That's why these 4 electrons per Moire unit cell. You know, 4 appears many times in this Magic Angle twisted Bilayer graphene business. Okay, so the system, as you go through each integer, decides to flavor polarize, you know, in one of those directions. So I will mention a little bit more about that later. Okay, so oh yeah, I had here a close, you know, a zoom in on these regions. You know, this is again the inverse compressibility. Inverse compressibility, you should think of the compressibility is like the density of states. So inverse compressibility is inverse density of states. Okay, and what you can see here is that, you know, if you start from charge neutrality, you have your 4 flavors, you know, spin up, spin down, valley k prime. You start filling them all at the same time. But for example, when you are close to filling factor 1, so 1 electron per Moire unit cell. So when you're close to 1/4 filling of each of these flavors, the system decides to spontaneously fill 1 flavor completely and empty all other 3. Okay, and then the story repeats. You fill in the other 3 flavors, and at some point, you know, the system decides to fill 2 flavors, empty the other 2, etc. And in a simple model, this gives rise to this sawtooth behavior. Okay, you know, this is a very simple model. There are plenty of things that one needs to go from this to the actual experimental data, and there's many interesting things like negative compressibility, etc. But this is just to give you a flavor of what happens here. Okay, there's a series of phase transitions at each integer. Okay, so let me tell you about Trilayer now. So the structure that I want to talk about is mirror-symmetric magic angle twisted trilayer graphene, so MATTG. In this structure, you have the bottom and the top layers perfectly aligned, okay, on top of each other, 0 degrees between these 2, bottom and top, and exactly aligned on top of each other. And the middle layer is rotated or twisted by an angle with respect to these 2. Okay, so if you want from the bottom, you twist an angle minus theta and then back plus theta, so that this one is exactly on top of this one. Okay? So this is a structure that was analyzed by Islam Khalaf and collaborators, and it's called, you know, often A twisted A type of stacking. Okay? Related work on the system was by other people, and related work on twisted trilayer and multilayer systems. It's also by, you know, other people, and I know that Jose has done also interesting work in this type of systems. So now the electronic structure for magic angle twisted trilayer graphene can be thought of as that of the bilayer plus monolayer graphene, except that it is the bilayer but with the square root of 2 larger tunneling, you know, matrix element between these 2 layers. Okay, so if you have these 3 layers with, you know, tunneling T between this layer, between each pair of layers, then you can decompose this diagonal into a block diagonal form where one of the, you know, blocks is magic angle twisted bilayer graphene with the square root of 2 larger coupling, and then monolayer graphene. Okay, so this means that the magic angle for magic angle twisted trilayer graphene is the magic angle for the bilayer case times square root of 2. Okay? So that's 1.1 degree times square root of 2. That's around close to 1.6 degrees. Yeah? So that also means that the Moire wavelength, which for magic angle twisted bilayer graphene is around 13 nanometers, for the trilayer case is 9 nanometers. So it's a shorter Moire wavelength, which can have implications for the strength of Coulomb interactions. Okay? Now, this is the electronic structure when there is no vertical displacement field, electric displacement field applied to the structure. Okay, and as you can see, it's indeed the combination of a set of flat bands, which come from the magic angle twisted bilayer graphene-like part, and then you have the regular massless, you know, Dirac electrons from the monolayer part. Okay, now this is at 0 displacement field. Okay, now in our structures, in our devices, we have the magic angle twisted trilayer graphene is in a whole bar geometry, and we have bottom and top gate electrodes. Therefore, we can independently change the filling factor, the charge density, and the vertical displacement electric field. Okay, and the electronic structure, you know, these two, you know, the monolayer-like band and the magic angle bilayer-like band, they are, you know, in the, you know, orthogonal, but, you know, they're uncoupled. But if you apply a transverse electric field and you break the mirror symmetry, you couple them, okay? So this is the electronic structure in the presence of a finite displacement field. As you can see, this sort of, you know, this Dirac crossing, you know, lifts, you know, and splits like that, yeah? Now, let me start showing you some data. So do we have evidence that indeed this system has this coexistence of flat and massless Dirac bands? Yes, okay. So if you have zero displacement field and you measure now, this looks a little bit complicated. I'll show you simpler looking data. This is just to show you that indeed we have those two bands coexistent. So this is a derivative of the Hall resistance, Rxy, as a function of magnetic field, okay? This is as a function of filling factor and magnetic field at low fields, okay? And what you can see is that we have at each integer, we have a vertical feature, okay? Those are, you know, the equivalent of the insulator or semi-metal states for the magic angle twisted Bilayer graphene-like part of the electronic structure. And then on top of that, we have this sort of parabola. This is not really a parabola. What you are seeing is the Landau-Fan diagram of the monolayer graphene-like part. This is the Landau levels. All of these traces are the Landau levels of the monolayer-like part. And the reason why you see it, you know, waving rather than straight lines as you would usually see it is because what you're seeing is the actual chemical potential of the monolayer-like, of the chemical potential of the magic angle bilayer-like band measured by the Landau levels of the monolayer-like band, okay? So this is something that we have investigated also in coupled monolayer bilayer systems, except that now our monolayer band is embedded in the system. So it's quite interesting, and, you know, you can read more about this in this paper, okay? And, you know, here you can see actually negative compressibility, etc. You take the derivative of this, it looks like the cascade of phase transitions data that I just showed you a moment ago. So this is the monolayer band, you know, and the bilayer band. If you now, and in fact, you know, if we put our chemical potential near 4 electrons per more unit cell, so we're here, and we cross only the monolayer-like band, and you measure the quantum Hall effect, you measure the, you know, half integer, you know, relativistic quantum Hall effect of monolayer graphene, okay? So we know that indeed the electrons are just monolayer-like, graphene-like. Now, if you apply a finite displacement field, okay, and you explore this region, then you get rid of that monolayer-like band, okay? And you only see features, these vertical features associated with the magic angle twisted Bilayer-like band. Now, let me tell you about robust superconductivity. So as I mentioned earlier, okay, at the beginning of the introduction, if you want to see robust superconductivity, you have to show zero resistance. Here we go. This is the resistance of one of our magic angle twisted Trilayer graphene devices. Now, this is a fit to the Halperin-Nelson formula, Nelson-Halperin formula for TBKT that can be obtained. You know, TBKT, okay, is about 2.3 Kelvin. TC at 50% normal state resistance, about 2.9 Kelvin. Now, these two-dimensional systems, with low, remember, these are the lowest density two-dimensional superconductors that exist. They typically have relatively broad transitions. In the community, we've been mostly quoting TC's 50% value. I think we are evolving towards, this TBKT, which is a little bit of a more fair assessment of the critical, temperature of the systems, because this can be very broad. So sometimes you get artificially high TCs. Okay, so zero resistance. Now, flat VI characteristics with sharp switching. There you go, at 100 millikelvin. You can do this as a function of temperature, okay? You can also look at this, in log scale to, again, determine, a TBKT, which is, very much consistent with this one. And then, because we can tune the system electrostatically, okay, we have, of course, superconducting domes. This is the dome around 2 holes per more unit cell, okay? You have a big dome here and a much smaller dome here. We call this -2 minus delta. Delta means extra doping, okay? So this -2 plus delta, we're adding electrons. Here we're adding extra holes with respect to filling factor nu equals -2. This is the two sets of domes for 2 plus delta and 2 minus delta. Okay, so we have 4 superconducting domes in this system at this particular electric field. I'll show you more in a moment. So, and in a magnetic field, we of course suppress superconductivity, and we also see Josephson phase coherence. Okay, so if you go to optimal doping, so a region where you have very strong superconductivity, and you apply a perpendicular magnetic field, you have a suppression of superconductivity initially very fast, and then you have a long tail up to very high critical field. I'll show you more. I'll tell you more about this in a moment. And if you go to a region near the edge of the dome where you know that this source is going to break up your system into small, into superconducting islands coupled by non-superconducting regions, then you can measure these Fraunhofer-like oscillations, okay? And you have various patterns depending on what is the random network of user injunctions that you have, okay? Okay, so magic angle twisted Trilayer graphene is a robust superconductor. Now, the system is extremely tunable, much more than the bilayer case, actually. So we have now these two independent knobs, charge density and electric displacement field, okay? So this is what the resistivity in the color scale as a function of displacement field, okay, divided by epsilon naught on this vertical axis and filling factor on this axis looks like, okay? Now, as you can see, this is quite a complex phase diagram. Let me guide you a little bit through it. Okay? These light blue regions are regions where you have superconductivity, okay? And as you can see, it occurs mostly between filling factors -2 and -3 and +2 and +3, but there are also these interesting branches happening there, okay? And then yellow indicates high, resistive features with high resistance, for example, near charge neutrality, the typical, but also you see features in certain, for certain displacement fields at integers and so on, okay? Which are reminiscent of what happened in magic angle twisted bilayer graphene. Now, I want to point out to you this diagram, okay, this phase diagram is, if you look from 0, top half and bottom half is largely symmetric, okay? You can even see these features like this, which are also top and bottom symmetric in displacement field, these branches, etc. Okay? Now, electron doping and hole doping from charge neutrality, okay? So left and right, there is some degree of symmetry, although it is less symmetric, okay? But you can see there is also a degree of symmetry, including these branches, etc. But of course, there are asymmetries. This big yellow region is not as, it's not very pronounced here. There's no yellow here, right, etc. Again, this mimics a little bit the relative asymmetry or symmetry, depending how you want to look at the half full or half empty glass of water, in magic angle twisted bilayer graphene. Okay. Now I'll come back more to all of these features. Now, in the system, okay, this was a measurement of the resistivity at 0 magnetic field at low temperatures, okay? We can try now to measure other properties of the system and see if we can correlate different properties. So what I'm showing here is the normalized Hall density. What do I mean by that? I mean, the Hall density NH, which is 1 over the, the whole, 1 over Rxy divided by magnetic field, okay? And, typically the Hall density is telling you about the density of carriers, in your system, of, free carriers to move in your system. And I'm normalizing it by NS and multiplying by 4, okay? I'm dividing essentially by the filling factor, okay? Which is the gate induced, externally induced charge density, okay? By the gate voltage. So this is what it looks like, this normalized Hall density as a function of displacement field and filling factor. And as you can see, it's also a complex diagram, okay, phase diagram. Now, most of the features in this phase diagram can be associated with one of the 3 situations or one of the 3, characteristics that I'm going to show now. In some regions here in this phase diagram, you see that the Hall density, the normalized Hall density changes sign, smoothly through zero. Okay, you go, for example, from dark blue then into white, dark blue, light blue, white, light red, dark red. Okay, that's what the response that you would expect at a Dirac point or at a gap. Okay, so for example, this happens here near charge neutrality. Okay, you go from dark blue, white, light red, dark red. Okay, so that happens there. It happens also in some of the regions. Other regions are characterized by what we call a reset in the normalized Hall density. Okay, your Hall density grows and then exhibits a drop close to zero, but without changing sign, and then it continues to grow. This can happen for red. Okay, so light red, dark red, light red, dark red, or with blue. Okay, perhaps this is most pronounced here. You can see that this goes from light blue, dark blue, then white, then lighter blue, darker blue. Okay, there's a reset that happens there. Yeah, and then another feature is associated with Van Hoff singularities. Okay? At a Van Hoff singularity, your RxY changes sign smoothly through zero, which means 1 over RxY, or Hall density, diverges and changes sign. So you go from, sort of light blue, dark blue, flip sign to dark red, and then light red. Okay, this is something that you can see, for example, here or here. You can see this goes from light blue, dark blue, switches abruptly to dark red, and then lighter red. Okay, so to zeroth order, most of the features in this phase diagram can be attributed to one of these three situations, not everything, but largely. Okay, so now we can correlate this map with this map and see if any of the features here can be identified or correlated with any feature here, etc. Okay, let's look in particular on the superconducting regions. Okay, so, but just superimposing these two diagrams could be too messy, so let me do this schematically. So this is a schematic of, in all of these regions in this phase diagram, in displacement field and filling factor. Okay, these dark blue regions are where superconductivity is present and very robust. These light blue regions is regions where superconductivity is present but quite weak, but it's still present there. Okay, and then the critical temperature is very small, in those regions. Now let me put the features associated with each of those three situations in the normalized Hall density in this map. Okay, so gap Dirac behavior is seen along these red lines. The most pronounced one is charge neutrality, but also other regions. Okay, there are gap or Dirac-like behavior. Resets occur in these regions. Okay, so basically at almost every integer at zero displacement field. Okay, and Van Hoff singularities behavior occur in those regions. Okay, so as you can see, okay, in particular, if you want to look for where does superconductivity occur and what is bounding it, what are the boundaries of the superconducting phase, you can see that superconductivity occurs mostly between -2 and -3 and between 2 and 3, but also at large displacement field, it occurs, for example, between 1 and 2, okay, or between -1 and -2, okay, and it sometimes does not occur in some regions between 2 and 3, okay. What captured our attention most about this diagram, okay, are these type of boundaries. Okay? Turns out in certain regions, superconductivity is bounded by Van Hoff singularities. Okay, so let me show you this now in the actual data. Okay, if you measure resistivity along this yellow line, actually it's a little bit shorter than this line. It doesn't quite reach this region. Okay, but roughly in this electric field. Okay, if you measure resistivity, you measure zero resistance. Here when there is superconductivity, and then you cross the boundary, and the resistance increases, of course, out of the superconducting state. Yeah? Now you measure what is TBKT, okay, the Sonsky-Koster-Litaulis transition, okay, or if you want critical temperature, it's finite there, and it ends right, of course, when the resistivity starts, when the system stops being superconducting, okay? Now, we can measure the effective mass by measuring the temperature dependence of the Shunikov-Haas oscillations, okay, around this, across this line too. And we can see that the effective mass diverges at that point, okay? That point corresponds in our normalized Hall density to the von Hoff singularity, okay? So we can see that not only it looks like a von Hoff singularity because of this feature in the Hall density, but it also has a diverging, effective mass, as you would have, density of states is diverging at that point, okay? And what you can see is that TC, rather than increasing, as your density of states gets higher and higher, okay, your TC actually decreases. And in fact, it ends your superconducting phase at the von Hoff singularity, okay? This is very much against our intuition from weak coupling BCS type superconductivity, where high density of states leads to high critical temperature, okay? So not only it decreases TC as the density of states increases, is that at the point where it should be maximum, it's actually 0, and it's bounded, the superconductivity. In fact, that forms the boundary of your superconducting region, okay? I'll come back to this in a moment. Let me tell you now about the coupling strength of this superconductivity, okay? The normalized coupling strength. So if you measure the, TBKT versus filling factor and versus transverse displacement field, okay, we can have this, three-dimensional plot, okay, of TBKT versus D and nu. I'm eliminating the middle part where it's not superconducting, okay? I'm focusing on the superconducting regions. And then you can have, this, okay? As you can see, it's highest between -2 and -3, and then between 2 and 3, and also some inner branches, okay? This is sort of similar to magic angle twisted Bilayer graphene. This is also the strongest superconducting dome between -2, -3, okay? If you project this into a planar, into this plane, okay, you can see the strength of TBKT in this map, okay? Now, because this is a little bit complicated always to look at color plots, let me show you trace, I'm gonna show you a trace at optimal electric field, TBKT at optimal electric field versus filling factor, and also a trace at optimal density versus electric field. Again, this system is very highly tunable, so we have many knobs, okay? So this is TBKT, this blue trace, as a function of filling factor at optimal electric field. As you can see, there is a small, superconducting dome in TBKT here when you dope with electrons with respect to the 2 holes per more unit cell state. And then there is a bigger superconducting dome, okay, here for when you add extra holes. Now, very interestingly, we can, by doing temperature-dependent measurements and magnetic field measurements of the system, we can extract the superconducting coherence length, the Ginzburg-Landau superconducting coherence length, as a function of filling at this optimal electric field, okay? And this is what it looks like, okay? The superconducting coherence length decreases, it sort of bottoms, okay, around optimal doping, and then has a jump up and then continues evolving, okay? This is an extremely short superconducting coherence length for this ultra low density superconductor, okay? Just to give you an idea of this, let me plot the average interparticle distance for the system, okay? Along the same axis. This is the average interparticle distance, okay? So you can see that the superconducting coherence length is pretty much bounded here by your average interparticle distance. You can repeat the same thing by now looking at TBKT versus displacement field at optimal density, okay? You can also measure the superconducting coherence length, and this is the average interparticle distance at this optimal density, okay? As you can see, this system, if you interpret, okay, the superconducting coherence length as the Cooper pair size, as you would typically do in the weak coupling BCS limit, okay, your Cooper pair size is of the same order as the average interparticle distance at optimal conditions, okay? So now, of course, it's not obvious that you can interpret it once you reach this limit, okay? But let's say it's clear that our Cooper pairs are tightly bound in the system. So this is very reminiscent of, the situation that you have when you have a BCS to BEC crossover, okay? So this is a plot from Heidrun and Arias' review about BCS-BEC crossover, okay? In the BCS limit, your Cooper pairs are much larger than your average interparticle distance. In the BEC limit, you have very tightly bound molecules. The crossover typically occurs when these two length scales are similar, okay? When the Cooper pair size is of the same order as the interparticle distance. Okay? Now, in 3 dimensions, okay, the maximum value of Tc over your Fermi temperature Tf is 0.22, and it happens at the crossover. Okay, in 2 dimensions, the maximum value of TBKT. Okay, in 2 dimensions we speak about BKT. So the maximum value of TBKT over TF is actually 0.125, and it is reached at the BCS-BEC crossover. Now, because we measure the electron density in our system and also the effective mass, we know what's the value of our Fermi temperature, okay? This is the measurement of the effective mass of our electrons as a function of filling, okay? Because we have also TBKT, we can divide TBKT by TF, and this is what we get for our system at optimal electric field as a function of filling factor, okay? You can do the same thing as a function of displacement field at optimal density, okay? And you have this TBKT over TF, yeah? And as you can see, TBKT over TF reaches a very large value. This is actually 0.125, okay? So TBKT over TF reaches values in excess of 0.1, with the maximum happening actually at about 0.125. Now, I don't want to make too big a story out of the fact that it coincides with 0.125. This theoretical limit that I mentioned before is for the case of cold atoms, where it's very clear that 2 fermionic atoms bind to make a boson, and the mass of the boson is twice the mass of the atoms, of the fermionic atoms. That's not necessarily the case for a system of electrons. So that limit could be different for an electronic system. But okay, you can see that it reaches about that value. This is by far the strongest, the highest value of TBKT over TF for any superconductor in any material, okay? In any 2-dimensional material. So if in an Uemura, in a plot of, critical temperature versus Fermi temperature, okay, in log-law scale, okay, this is the line where T is equal to TBC, so the BCS crossover in 3 dimensions, okay? Typical conventional superconductors are sort of near this corner of this, so-called Uemura plot. I don't know, sorry, the reference should be down there. It's probably hidden by the graph. Aluminum, for example, has a TC of about 1 Kelvin and a gigantic electron density. So it superconducts very modestly. As you go towards this diagonal, you see typically more and more exotic type of superconductors. In particular, all the unconventional superconductors are in this purple band, okay? Magic angle twisted bilayer graphene, when we were reporting TC's 50% normal state resistance, was here, very strongly coupled, okay? Now, this is the TBKT 0.25, okay, that I mentioned, TBKT for the BCS-BEC crossover limit in 2 dimensions. If we actually reanalyze our data for TBKT, okay, in magic angle twisted bilayer graphene, the point is there, still very highly coupled. Here is where the corresponding data for magic angle twisted trilayer graphene are, okay? It's substantially stronger coupled than magic angle twisted bilayer graphene and higher than any other 2-dimensional superconductor. I should mention that I learned recently about a work by Iwasa on a different layered superconductor where they also claim to have reached the BCS-BEC crossover. The paper is in the archive, and I should update this slide with the reference. Okay, let me just take a couple of minutes to tell you about the connection, the deep connection between nu equals 2 and superconductivity. So where does superconductivity emerge from in this system? Okay, so as you saw, the superconductivity as small displacement fields is bounded by these two resets, mostly, okay, between 2 and 3. And then a large displacement field, something extra can happen, okay? So it's bounded by Van Hoff singularities plus gap Dirac regions, okay? At large displacement field, resets at small displacement fields. So it turns out that through analyzing this data, we have realized that the superconductivity arises upon doping the nu equals 2 in absolute value, so -2 or +2, broken flavor symmetry ground state, okay? What does that mean? Okay? Remember, at each reset, at each integer, there is a sort of this reset at small displacement fields, okay? This is something that manifests itself in the quantum oscillations also, okay? I know this is a little bit complicated, and I'm gonna go a little bit quickly through it. I'm happy to take questions or discuss with any of you, or you can go to the paper to see the details. At small displacement fields, the Landau-Fan diagram, when you look at the quantum oscillations, they all point outwards. All of these lines are pointing outwards, as you can see here, okay? After each reset, okay, there's a new Fermi surface. You can have 3, 2, or 1 Fermi surfaces, depending whether you're at nu equals 1, 2, or 3, okay? And that's why the Landau-Fan diagrams point away from charge neutrality, okay, outwards. Now, at large displacement field, what we realize is that we have some Landau-Fan diagrams pointing inwards, okay? Pointing inwards. And that is key, because if a Landau-Fan diagram points inwards, it's telling you it's resulting from whole doping of a certain many-body ground state. Whereas if it points outward, is you continue to do, same carrier doping. So in this case, electron doping, in this case, whole doping. If a Landau-Fan diagram points inwards here and outwards, then you have both electron doping and whole doping out of this nu equals 2 many-body ground state. And that region here, which has Landau-Fan diagram pointing inwards, okay, it's key to understand what is the origin of the superconductivity, okay? What happens is that usually at low displacement field, this reset, you're filling your system with electrons, and then you're resetting close to charge neutrality, and now you continue filling with electrons your system. However, it seems that at large displacement field, that phase transition that at low displacement field leads to a reset near charge neutrality, but for electron doping, at large displacement field, the presence of the Van Hoff singularity triggers a reset earlier, at an earlier filling, okay? So you go to a nu equals 2 symmetry broken phase with 2 Fermi surfaces, but because you do it before nu equals 2, these 2 Fermi surfaces are whole dope. And that's why you have this branch, okay? The superconductive branch corresponds to whole doping of the nu equals 2 many-body ground state. This part corresponds to electron doping of the nu equals 2 many-body ground state. Okay? So we can look at this schematically here. This is showing the filling factor, and here the actual filling of your flavors. Okay, you can see here the 2 Fermi surfaces which are filled. This purple means superconductivity. Okay, now as you increase the displacement field, your Van Hoff singularity leads to a, it goes to a reset which is too strong. It actually leads into whole doping, actually, of your system. So you have 2 Fermi surfaces, but at an earlier filling factor, and then this thing becomes even stronger at larger displacement field. Okay, and we can see that in both regions of the phase diagram. So I know this was a little bit fast. I hope you can look at the paper. So let me just summarize. So I have shown you the first robust Moire superconductor beyond magic angle twisted Bilayer graphene. This system has exceptional tunability. Okay, there is a non-trivial interplay between the Van Hoff singularities and superconductivity. Van Hoff singularities don't help the system in terms of increasing TC, but they do trigger transitions to superconducting phases. okay? We can reach the ultra strong coupling regime, and there's a deep connection between superconductivity and nucleus too. You can look at the archive papers. A shorter version will appear in Nature today. Now, in terms of outlook, this paper gave us a recipe to fabricate this type of structures. So perhaps, in a few months, we'll be talking about Moiré Magic 4.0, 5.0, etc. Yeah. This paper and the subsequent papers, they argue that the key to superconductivity is the symmetry, C2ZT symmetry, 180-degree rotation around an axis out of plane and time reversal symmetry. It turns out magic angle twisted bilayer graphene and this mirror-symmetric trilayer graphene have this symmetry, whereas all of the other systems that I told you that the superconductivity was fragile, none of those has this symmetry. So while we still have to check if this is true, okay? So far, the two cases we have checked, that's okay. We still have to check more. It could be that this is indeed an important ingredient. And lastly, of course, everybody's wondering about what's the symmetry of the other parameter and what type of exotic superconductivity might this be or not, okay? Particularly, this paper argues, or a follow-up paper, sorry, argues about a special electronic type mechanism called skyrmionic superconductivity. We still have to see if that's the case. So with this, I want to thank, the most important, this is the most important slide to thank my group members and collaborators. This is largely the work of Yuan Sao and Jane Park, okay, with help for early experiments by Daniel and by a lot of our collaborators at MIT. And I've mentioned also our experiments with Shahalinani. We have also very interesting experiments with Elie Seldorf I didn't have time to tell you about, and also our theory collaborators, materials collaborators, and of course, funding agencies and other foundations. And I want to thank you all for your attention, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Pablo, for this really amazing talk and for showing us these very inspiring results on twisted graphene trilayers. So now we have time for questions. So if you have a question, you can either raise your hand or you can write it in the chat and we will read it. And there's already one question by Adi. Adi, please go ahead.
Hi, Pablo.
Adi.
Thanks for the talk. Hi. Nice to meet you in Finland. So I want to ask, what happens if you go beyond the NS=4? Do you see anything? If you're out of the flat band, do you still see something that has a Moiré nature to it, or is it just graphene?
So
graphene.
Honestly, we haven't looked much. The thing is, this system has so many knobs, because of the displacement field and the density and the magnetic field. The data that I have shown in this 1 hour took 8 months to take. So we limited ourselves, to a region of phase space that we've explored. Now that you mention it, it makes full sense to look a little bit, beyond to nu=5 or 6 to see if something exotic happens. But we actually didn't have time to look at it. But yes, it would be nice to look. Yeah.
I see. Thanks.
I should mention one thing, perhaps, which is that the system is a little bit different from bilayer graphene in that we have the massless Dirac band too, right? So as we add charge density to our system, initially, the vast majority of the charge density goes into the bilayer in the flat bands, right? But then as you keep adding charge density, you start putting more and more the massless Dirac band with density, right? Density of states increases of the massless Dirac band.
Right.
So it gets harder and harder to reach higher filling factors of the flat. At some point, to reach the Moiré superlattice bands, you have to fill a substantial fraction of the massless Dirac band, which continues to be there. So it gets harder to explore the other Moiré mini bands because there is the massless Dirac band there. But it's still nonetheless possible to reach some more. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's another question by Abdu. Abdu, please go ahead.
Okay, I have a question regarding any low-level excitation that you would see above transition temperature, and if not, could that be because there is some disorderness in the magic angle, for example, that washes out local excitation?
So I'm not sure about what type of excitations you
like bosonic excitation. I mean, it could be like a phonon or could be excitons or something like that, excitonic. Could be the cause of superconductivity.
So we have measured the resistance to higher temperatures above transition temperature, actually to pretty high temperature. The system exhibits also a linear in temperature resistivity similar to Magic Angle Twisted Bilayer graphene, which is reminiscent of strange metal behavior. The origin of that linear in T resistivity is not well understood in Magic Angle Twisted Bilayer graphene, of course, much less in this system, okay? Initially, some people thought that that might be related to phonons. Now it seems that phonons cannot explain the story and people are talking about magnetic fluctuations and excitations, okay? It still very much remains, to be understood. But we have done a little bit of measurement, but again, this is the first report and we still need to do many more experiments in this system. I can imagine that the system exhibits similar type of disorder as Magic Angle Twisted Bilayer graphene. There's probably some twist angle disorder, okay, in addition to chemical potential inhomogeneities, although it seems that those are weak in these structures. Twist angle disorder is probably a bit more dominant. I should mention that because the twist angle is larger, there is less relaxation and less disorder probably in the trilayer case. Our success yield for trilayer devices, we made for this experiments 3 devices and all 3 superconductors. So it was 100% success yield, of course with a limited data set, but that still is, our yield for the bilayer case is about 50% in my group. Most groups, probably because we've been doing it the longest, most groups is like 1 in 10 or 1 in 100 type of luck with hitting the twist angle, etc. But larger angles are more stable and are easier to nail down. So it could be that the system is a bit more robust also from that point of view. I know that the group of Philip Kim, who also, as I mentioned, has similar results, they also were quite lucky with making devices in the sense that they made the devices and they got right away. I think they're reporting in their paper 2 devices, which were on first trial or on quick succession, So could be that this system is a bit more robust.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat by Stefan Roche, which is whether if the Cooper pairs are extended over the 3 layers.
So yes, presumably yes. Okay, so again, one would have to see exactly how the what mechanism and what microscopic origin the superconductivity is about. But the the electronic structure is such that you have linear combination of electrons in your 3 layers. Okay, so I would expect that the Cooper pair formation in the flat bands is actually the 3 layers intervene. Okay, sort of the bonding state.
Yep, thanks. So I don't see more questions in the chat or in the participants, so perhaps I can ask one question. So did you have opportunity to check what is the critical in-plane field of this superconducting state and whether if it is, let's say, substantially different from the twisted bilayer?
So we don't have yet data that I can report on the in-plane field. I think it would be an interesting experiment. In the twisted bilayer, in the Magic Angle Twisted Bilayer graphene case, several groups have reported about in-plane field measurements. In our original paper, I think it was our original paper that we reported first, we seem to have a little bit of Pauli violation limit, like 20%, but you're defining critical temperature at 50%, which is a little bit, so we couldn't say whether there is really a substantial violation of Pauli limit. Then in subsequent work, we realized that the in-plane critical field is anisotropic, okay? So, and we didn't have enough field to test for the largest axis of the ellipses, so we saw this nematicity, and for the largest axis of the ellipses, it seems like we may violate Pauli by a bit more, but we didn't have enough field with our vector magnet to actually check this. So I think it remains a little bit to be seen in the bilayer case exactly if there is any violation of Pauli limit or not. And if there is, by how much, okay? And it would be, of course, interesting to look at the system. The fact that your Cooper pairs are very strongly bound, okay, in the system, suggests that, you know, the pairing gap could be much, you know, very large in general, okay? And your TC is determined by, you know, by phase fluctuations. And that could have interesting implications in terms of, you know, field, but yeah, it remains to be seen.
Yep, thanks a lot. And there's another question in the chat by Stefan Roche, which is, why don't we see fractional quantum Hall effect in these systems if they are clean enough and we look at low enough temperature and high magnetic field?
Mm-hmm. So the systems, the flat bands, okay, have much higher effective mass, and therefore the mobility of the systems is substantially lower than regular monolayer graphene or regular bilayer graphene. So from that point of view already, you would expect it to be less likely that you would see fractional quantum Hall effect under the same conditions, okay? Having said that, if you look in detail at some of the data of some of the groups that have published, including our own, there are some signatures of stuff going on at fractional filling factors of the Moiré superlattice, okay? And, you know, we need to do more measurements, but, you know, I don't think, you know, I don't think it'll take 10 years to get to fractional chain insulators and things like that.
Yep, great, thanks. So I don't see more questions in the chat or in the participants, so perhaps now it is a good time to stop the colloquium. So Pablo, thanks so much for this really amazing and inspiring talk on twisted graphene trilayer. And thank you everybody for coming today to the colloquium. And we will have the next colloquium in 2 weeks.
Thank you very much, everyone.